begin.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for joining us on this special evening. Before we get started, I would like to thank our Wellness and Leadership Committee from the board, chaired by Liz Dennison and Maureen Brown, for bringing this event to life, both for the girls and for our Sacred Heart families. And I also want to thank, of course, our Parents Association for their generous support. And as we do, I just want to offer a brief prayer to frame us and begin tonight. And these are words of Janet Erskine Stewart that hopefully will guide us as we think about who our girls are, who they're becoming, and how we can all support them. So in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. God has his plan for every one of you. Your path and calling in life are marked out by his providence. Either you have entered upon them already, or you are still learning and preparing yourselves for the work of your life. In either case, the guidance of God's providence is personal. To God, we are not flocks and herds driven about in groups to a common end. As star differs from star in brightness, as every planet has its own orbit, so every life has its own path and destiny marked out by God. It has its own trials, the graces of every day attend it, and in great measure, its true history can be known only to God. Amen. So with that, I'm just going to give a very brief introduction because we want to maximize our time with Lisa Damour. As many of you know, Dr. Lisa Damour is a leading psychologist. She's currently the director of the Laurel School Center for Research for Girls. She's the author of Untangled and Under Pressure. She's a regular contributor to the New York Times on topics we all need and look forward to. And most importantly, perhaps, she has a great Sacred Heart connection, which I will let her explain. So I'm going to send it over to you, Lisa. And again, we're just thrilled to have you here.
I'm delighted to be here. And hello, families, and thank you for sharing your daughters with me today. I was with the 9 through 12, and we had so much fun, and they were so incredible. I said to them, what do you want me to tell your parents tonight? I have a list. I'll give you it as we go. They were fantastic. But as Meg mentioned, so when I was in 3rd through 5th grade, my family lived in Chicago, and I attended Sacred Heart on Sheridan Road. Here's my class picture from 3rd grade. I'm down here in the bottom right above the Chicago, Illinois thing. That's me. And actually, Miss Trajano, who's up at the top middle, and I are still close. I'm 51, she's like 78. And we talked this weekend. Whenever I go to Chicago, I stay with her. So Sacred Heart Education has a very, very special place in my heart. And I still stay very connected to Sheridan Road and know how powerful and important the work of Sacred Heart Schools is. So the other thing that's actually important is I have 2 daughters. I have a daughter who's a 5th grader, she's almost 11, and I have a daughter who's a 12th grader who's almost 18. So in addition to trying to understand teenage girls as a psychologist, I'm also trying to do it at home with, mixed results, as one can imagine. So here's our plan. I have a slideshow. I want to run us through it just to cover all sorts of things. There's so much I want to share with you. So I'm going to go fast, and then I want to hear your questions. And so put them in the chat. And either Liz or Meg will pitch them to me, and we'll just get to as many as we absolutely can. I'll talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then try to leave us a good 15 minutes for questions. Okay, so now let's turn to my slideshow. So this is the title of my most recent commercial book, and it came out in 2019, before the pandemic, before the huge whopping mass of stress and anxiety that fell on everybody. And it's very much targeted around girls and what they face, though what I hear constantly about my work about girls is that 80% will also apply to your sons, which I'm not surprised by. But I really wanted to think through how we can take best care of girls in light of their lives in general, and then of course current or most recent conditions. So just to lead us off, the bad news is even before the pandemic, stress and anxiety were rising for girls. The much better news is there's a huge amount that we can do to buffer this and to make this better. And a lot of what I'm going to share with you, I shared with your daughters in their way. So my hope is that it feels a little wraparound, that they have a way of thinking about topics like stress, anxiety, conflict, schoolwork, and and appearance in some ways that may be new and useful, and that you'll have a, sort of a parallel view on the things that I talked about with them. So to start, and we spent real time on this, is we can actually change how we talk about stress. And if we change how we talk about it, it actually gets a whole lot less stressful. What is important to know here is that psychologists think and talk about stress very, very differently than the general population does. The word on the street in the general population, you've heard this, there's no getting around this, is that stress is bad. You want to avoid it, you want to minimize it, it's toxic, you want to not put yourself in situations where you feel too much of it. This is a widely held belief. No one in psychology is on board with this idea. We never have been. We have limits on how much stress we think is appropriate, but the general view in psychology is that stress is a normal and healthy function. It happens anytime we are adapting to new conditions. And, in some ways, the simplest way to put it is change equals stress. So if you take on an exciting new job, you may want the job very much. You may enjoy it. You may be very glad about it. It's new. It's going to be stressful. All of you remember how stressful it was to become a parent for the first time. However wanted and wonderful that experience was, it's also ridiculously stressful because there's so much adaptation involved. And so in talking about this with your daughters today, I said to them, school's supposed to be stressful because school is actually supposed to bring about a fair bit of change in terms of your intellectual and academic capacities. And the analogy I gave them is that the stress of school is like the stress of strength training, that everyone knows if you want to gain muscle, if you want to gain capacity, you have to lift weights that are uncomfortably heavy. It's a lot more fun maybe if you go to the gym and lift weights that are light, don't ask anything of you, but everyone knows that's not actually going to get you what you came for. School operates in the exact same way. In order to gain intellectual capacity, in order to gain intellectual strength, you actually have to do work that is hard for you, or work at levels in terms of volume that are uncomfortably large. And the upshot of both lifting heavy weights and doing work that's harder than one is accustomed to is that it brings about change, it brings about adaptation, which means it brings about stress, but it also means it brings growth. And so not only are psychologists completely accepting of the idea of stress, that it's going to happen in our lives around good things and bad things, as long as those things involve change, we're going to feel stress. We're also sort of pro-stress because we're like, well, we're pro-growth. And so you're not going to have any growth if there's no stress. And what we know is that shift in mindset alone reduces stress. Because as long as people are holding on to the idea that stress is a bad thing, that it's inherently dangerous or toxic or harmful, well, then you have a double problem. Because if you're a student, first you have the stress of school, and then you become stressed about the fact that you're stressed, which is unnecessary, but that makes the whole thing worse. So to even reframe normal expectable stress as a growth-giving, if uncomfortable, process in and of itself reduces stress. It also then orients us to the question of recovery. And here again, the metaphor around stress is enormously helpful if we think about it in terms of being like strength training. And I said this to your daughters, strength training is actually a two-part process. There's what happens in the gym, and then there are the days where you don't go to the gym. And anyone who's good at strength training knows you have to recover, you have to let those muscles repair. That's actually as critical to the effort as the day in the gym was. And this is the same in terms of how we talk and think about stress of school, or the stress of the demands that are on our daughters, which is to say, yep, school is stressful. It's designed to be stressful. That's the whole program. That's how you're going to gain capacity. And it must be paired with recovery intervals. And it's a little corny to call them recovery intervals, but it's actually very deliberate. And I said to your girls, I call it recovery intervals. It's not time off. It's not downtime. It's not, being lazy. It is actually making sure there's enough capacity in terms of just quiet and recovery to actually consolidate the gains that happened while doing the difficult thing. The only time psychologists actually worry about stress, there's actually two conditions. One is trauma, so overwhelmingly horrible events. We are not on the side of those. And the other is what we call chronic stress. And the definition of chronic stress is no recovery. So that's when stress becomes problematic. It's not the stress itself, it's the absence of the capacity to recover. So as you are thinking about stress with your daughter and you're watching her navigate stress, the question isn't, is she stressed? Of course she's stressed. She's in school, she's a growing, learning person. The question is, does she have enough time to recover, repair, rebuild before she goes back into whatever gym she's going into? The stress of school is like the stress of weightlifting. If you never take a day off, if you're never able to recover, you don't usually need a whole day for the stress of school, but an afternoon, an evening, part of an evening, well, then you will burn out, you will get injured. And so the goal here is just to measure the amount of output and then the ability to recover. And that will be very individual to your kid. It'll depend on your kid in terms of how much time she needs to recover. Another thing that came up a lot, and I was going to address it here anyway, but it's actually a really perfect opportunity, is how we respond when they are stressed in front of us. And I will say a huge amount of parenting, and I will say as a mother of two daughters, a huge amount of parenting teenage girls is managing their very, very, very stressed out responses to things. And it's such a big part of the life in a home with a teenager and sometimes maybe teenage girls who we have socialized to be more expressive, that I created, I thought, is there any way, these meltdowns which happen in family life are so taxing and so overwhelming to me sometimes. Is there any way to have a strategy? Is there any way to have a reliable set of responses that I know will help? Because when my daughter becomes upset, it's, obviously it can be hard on us as parents. And of course, it never happens when we're fresh and ready. It happens at the end of the day when we're already tired or trying to move towards our own end of evening. And so I thought, let me see if I can spitball a strategy for this. And I ended up writing a 9-point strategy, which seems to work really well. So I turned it into a bookmark. Here's the bookmark. Now, what's important is I've mailed hundreds of these to Liz Dennison, and you're going to get them. So you'll get your own bookmarks. I'm going to walk you through it. If you don't want to wait for her to find you, it's on my website on the resources page. So it's drlisadamour.com resources. But this How to Manage a Meltdown bookmark, and I'm just going to walk you right through it, is a really, really effective way to manage as a parent in the most helpful way possible when your daughter's having kind of a tsunami of stress in her life. So there's 9 steps, as I mentioned. Now, what's important is you almost never do 9 steps. The top instruction here is pause between each step to see if it worked. If not, move forward to the next step. So if you really do them well, you very rarely get past the 3rd or 4th step. So the first step is listen without interrupting. So when our daughters are melting down, usually they are venting and complaining or upset or weepy or intense. And it can be tempting to jump in, to make suggestions, to try to redirect things. And what's kind of remarkable about very powerful emotions is they're very much like waves, not fires, that they rise, they hit an intensity, of a crest, and then they recede on their own. So when we listen without interrupting, we actually give that process a chance to happen. And even venting, even complaining, which can be tedious at times to listen to, for a lot of kids, that's just, they've gone through the day, they've picked up a lot of annoyances and frustrations, they've acted beautifully, gorgeously at school, and they did that in part because they knew they were going to come home and tell you all about all the things that went very badly wrong, and there's no need to solve or help or do anything. They just need to tell it all to us and then be done with it. I think a little bit over the course of a day, kids pick up a lot of emotional garbage and they stuff it in their pockets, and then they get home and they want to dump the garbage. This can be very hard sometimes as a parent if you're getting a lot of complaining and a lot of injustice, and sometimes if it's hard to listen without interrupting, or you're really wanting to come in with some guidance or advice, a helpful phrase can be, do you want my help or do you just need to vent? And most of the time they'll be like, I just need to vent, and they will carry on with venting, and you will have listened without interrupting, and that may actually end the meltdown. She may feel better. You may be done at step 1. If not, then you can go on to step 2, which is just offering empathy. Empathy is incredibly powerful at helping kids feel better. And so you can say things like, that stinks, I'm really sorry. Usually that's all girls want. And actually, when I was asking the girls about what they wanted me to pass along, that was one of the things, just tell them I want empathy. I don't need solutions. It is really, really true. They don't want solutions. Step 3 is to validate their distress, to say, you know what? It makes sense that you feel that way. Of course you're stressed. This is a very stressful time. You know, this is what you're doing is very hard. That alone is enough. For most kids, they're like, okay, that's what I wanted to hear. I just want to make sure there wasn't something wrong with me. It's a stressful situation. Thank you so much. And they're ready to go. Step 4, if you're still going, and you are very rarely still going if you do step 1, 2, and 3 earnestly, is to support coping. Say, is there anything I can do that won't make this worse? You know, do you want some tea? I'm big on tea. I serve a lot of tea in my house. It's a way of sort of being there and being present and offering solutions that really aren't solutions, because most things I can't fix. Step 5, if you are still going, express non-dismissive confidence. You can say to them, you know what, this is tough. You're tough too. Or I've seen you get through a lot of things. I know you'll get through this. It means the world for our daughters to hear this from us. Okay, step 6, now you can help problem solve. What's kind of funny is we often start at step 6. So if you feel like you've done 1 through 5 in earnest and your daughter is still upset, then you can say you actually can't help problem solve. You have to ask permission. You can say, do you want my help? Or I have some ideas. Do you want to hear them? If you get a yes, you're on to step 7, which is divide the problem into categories. Things we can do something about, things we can do nothing about. Then you're on to step 8, brainstorm solutions to the things that can actually be affected, where there's some control. And then at the end, step 9, support acceptance of the things that can't be changed. So, you know, she might say, I don't know when we're going to stop wearing masks sometimes, you know, I just can't stand it. And you say, yep, we don't know. We kind of have to live with this, but here's the thing. Let's pour all our energy on the things we can do something about, not pour our energy on the things we can't do something about. That will sort itself out. Let's save the energy for the things where we have some say. So in terms of stress, the overall big framing on it can make a really big difference in terms of how it feels. And then how we react when our daughters become swamped by stress can go very, very far to help them manage their stress more effectively. Okay. We can also change how we talk about anxiety. The story on anxiety is very similar to the story on stress in terms of how psychologists are actually a Grand Canyon away from the rest of the culture on this topic. So just as stress has a really terrible name in the culture and is actually quite seen as often a positive in psychology, anxiety is the same way. People tend to talk about anxiety as though it is pathological, it is problematic, it's a symptom that something's really wrong, it raises questions of, you know, is there a diagnosis afoot? In psychology, we see anxiety as a normal, healthy function. It is absolutely essential to human safety. And the way we see it is that it's a gift given to us by evolution. It's an alarm that rings when something's not right. So if we're driving and somebody swerves and cuts us off, we should have an anxiety response. It's a good thing to have an anxiety response. It trains attention on the problem and helps us to get focused and make sure we're safe. If your daughter has a big test coming up and she hasn't started studying and she starts to feel anxious, that's a really good thing. She should feel anxious. We'd be concerned if she wasn't anxious under those conditions. And when she starts to study, she'll feel better. That framing of anxiety as essential, normal, healthy, protective does the same thing as the reframing on stress. It actually reduces overall anxiety. And the reason for that, and you've seen this, I'm sure, in your home, especially if your daughter is worried that anxiety is always a bad thing, is that in the normal course of events, girls become anxious because there's things that get their attention and need to be paid attention to. But what also happens is they then become anxious about being anxious. They see it as a sign of some greater problem or some greater concern, and that creates its own additional distress. So one of the ways that I frame this for your daughters and that you can frame it with her is anxiety it's a friend. It's there to tell you that something's not right. It's there to alert you, to pay attention, to be on your toes, to make a change, to make a fix. I also talked with your daughters about how when anxiety feels too big, it's something that we can contain and control, that there are very good strategies and systems that work. Breathing is highly effective. And the biology behind why breathing is really effective is incredible. The brain and the lungs are designed to speak to each other. So when we become very anxious, the brain has signaled the lungs to go into overdrive. It's part of the fight or flight response. It gets a lot of oxygen out to our large muscle groups. And when we override that high, kind of quick and shallow breathing that comes with anxiety, Nerves on the surface of our lungs indicate to the brain that we're actually safe, that we're actually okay. Those nerves are there to do that job. They are always attending to how we're breathing. And so breathing can be a really powerful way to contain anxiety if it needs to be contained. Most of the time, though, the presence of anxiety is not grounds for concern. It is normal and healthy and part of how we stay safe. The exceptions are important to note. So there are a couple of times when anxiety is not considered to be healthy anxiety. One is if there's anxiety, but there's nothing wrong. To the degree that anxiety is an alarm, we only want it to ring when there's a real problem. The other time we become concerned about anxiety is if there's anxiety that's out of proportion to what's wrong, that's way too big for whatever's happening. So if your daughter has a test, she hasn't studied at all, she should be anxious, but we wouldn't want her to be having a panic attack over that. That would be too big of a response. And so that's when we would help with controlling that anxiety. Breathing can work. Reevaluating situations can work. We have a lot of strategies to help with containment. But other than that, other than those two conditions, anxiety should and really can, quite accurately be treated as a useful protective signal that helps keep girls very much on track and keeps them safe. We can also change how we talk about conflict. And I have fun talking with your daughters about this. And this is something that I find kind of fascinating, especially in the world of girls, which is we don't tend to talk with them very directly about conflict and how it works and the difference between healthy and unhealthy conflict. And I think the reason for this is like most grownups are not very at ease and fluent in this world. And I think it's very hard for us to teach them what we ourselves don't know. So I walked your daughters through some metaphors that I find really, really helpful in thinking about conflict and teaching about conflict. And I want you to have them handy also. One thing that is true is that a lot of people started unhealthy conflict, and it's really helpful to be able to actually make distinctions among different types of unhealthy conflict. But actually, I want to back up for a second. I think part of our challenge around talking with girls about conflict is we kind of hope they won't have any. That we sort of have this hope and this idea that, they'll get along, it'll be lovely, they'll be in an all-girls environment, it'll kind of keep things kind of sweet and easy, and it never goes down that way. And it's not that the girls are unpleasant or difficult or mean or any of that. We just have to deal with the realities that school is where you have been sent to be all day, every day with a whole bunch of people you didn't choose. So the conflict piece is absolutely inevitable. And I think that we haven't always done kids a service to not just greet it as inevitable and then prepare them to deal with it well. So I talked them through three main forms of unhealthy conflict that are very common. And these are not just kid forms of unhealthy conflict. These are just universal forms of unhealthy conflict that you see at all ages. And the metaphors I use, they're kind of goofy, but they really, really work. So the first metaphor I used for unhealthy conflict is to be a bulldozer, where you just run people over to get your way. You just are, bossy and aggressive until they give in. The second metaphor I used for unhealthy conflict is when people act as a doormat, when they just let people run them over. They don't stand up for themselves. They don't like the outcome, but they don't do anything to prevent it, and they feel bad about the outcome. The third form of unhealthy conflict that we talked about is to be a doormat with spikes, which is basically passive aggressive behavior. And this is so common that it actually gets subcategories. So the common subcategories of doormat with spikes are things like using guilt as a weapon, or playing the part of a victim, or involving third parties in what should really be a two-party disagreement. So rather than taking it up with the person you're upset about, you take it up with everybody else but them. So these are very common, and we default to them sometimes. And certainly we all have our places where we start. And I'm not proud of this, but left to my own devices, my first impulse is absolutely doormat with spikes. When I am frustrated with somebody, my passive aggressive ideas are pretty vivid. And what I've learned is just daydream about them, but not to actually act on them. If I'm going to have a conflict, I want to do it as a pillar. So this is one of the healthy options, which is to stand up for myself while being really respectful of the other person. Now, okay, this if I think is a really interesting question in the world of girls, because I've taken care of girls in a lot of different capacities for a long time. And one thing I have noticed is that in the well-meaning name of empowering our daughters and wanting to raise, strong, self-sufficient girls, I think at times adults encourage girls into conflicts that they really don't need to have. And here's what I mean. It happens all the time among us adults that there are people who annoy us or who say things that are obnoxious or that we come home and complain about that we have no intention of saying anything to them. We all have colleagues and neighbors and relatives where we don't like the way that we act, and they may even do things that we find hurtful or harmful, and we make a tactical decision to say nothing to them. And the reason we've made that decision is because we know at some level it's not worth it to say something to them. And we do this all the time. I mean, everyone here can think of a neighbor or a colleague or a relative where they just kind of let the behavior happen and do not, and very deliberately do not act as a pillar, or hopefully not also like a bulldozer doormat or doormat with spikes. We just sort of allow it. And having observed this, I started to think more and more about how reflexively, when a girl would come to me with a complaint or a concern about a friend or a classmate and how she'd been treated, I'd be like, but you need to say something to her. You need to get in there and let her know that she hurt your feelings. And I started to reconsider that. And so now when a girl comes my way to talk to me about a conflict, so maybe it's, she has a kid in her class who maybe she invited that kid to her birthday party, and now that kid's having a birthday party and hasn't invited her back. And she's hurt. So this is the conflict. So a student will come talk to me about that, or a girl will come talk to me about that in my practice, and I'll listen and I'll, empathize and say, that stinks. And yeah, I think a lot of people in your shoes would feel pretty lousy about that. And then I will often say, does it feel worth it to you to say something? That's how I phrase it. Does it feel worth it to you to say something? And then we'll really evaluate that question. Because if she's going to have a conflict, she should do it as a pillar, right? She shouldn't engage in bulldozer or doormat with spikes. But the if needs to be considered. And so these are the times when I will hear a student say, or a girl say, that it feels worth it to her. Maybe it's like a good friend, right? Or a friend that a relationship you care about. And then there's been this weird sort of rupture in it, and it really needs to be addressed so that you can move on together. Then, okay, let's think through pillar responses. Let's go do a pillar response. Or maybe her dignity is so hurt that regardless of how the person responds or even the quality of the relationship, she feels she needs to say something. Often girls will say it's not worth it. And they'll say this for any number of reasons. Sometimes they'll say like, oh no, I don't even like her. I don't even want to go to the party. They just wanted to, they were hurt that they weren't invited. And you know how that happens, where sometimes you hear about something, you're like, why wasn't I invited? I mean, I wouldn't have gone, but why wasn't I invited? So they have that too. And so sometimes they've just come to register the complaint, and having registered the complaint in the same way that we complain about colleagues at dinner, we're good to go. We don't need to do anything more than that. We just needed to tell someone who wasn't going to, tell everybody else. Other times the girl will say, oh yeah, no, I've known her since, third grade. If I pillar with her, she's going to doormat with spikes back. It's not worth it. Or it's just not a relationship I care that much about, right? I need to tell somebody. So offer these different models, think through these different models, model the best of these models, model being a pillar in your own home. But be open to the idea that girls may sometimes need to tell us about conflicts they're having, and that they have two responses that we should offer them in terms of those conflicts. One is to be a pillar if they're going to do something. And then the other is a metaphor called emotional Aikido. You can tell I really like metaphors. So emotional Aikido is a term that comes from therapy. And Aikido is this form of martial art, which I know nothing about beyond this, so there cannot be any follow-up questions about Aikido. But in Aikido, when somebody comes at you, the first thing you do is you actually turn to the side and dodge them and let them go past. And the rationale in Aikido is there's no tactical advantage to taking the first attack. Sometimes they just keep going, or they go bother somebody else, or they're knocked off balance. It's just not worth it to do this. And so sometimes if a girl comes and brings, complaint about a party she wasn't invited to, and I say, do you want to say something? And she's like, nope, not worth it. Or I don't even, doesn't bother me that much. I just needed to tell somebody. I'll say, okay, well, why don't you emotional Aikido this? Why don't you let it go by and see what happens next? If she keeps coming and bugging you, come on back, we'll figure it out. But maybe this will be one of those things where it's just not worth your energy to get into it. And the last thing that needs to be said on this, and I think it's always important to underscore with girls, this is not doormat. And I think this is where grown-ups sometimes get hung up too, is they feel like if that girl crossed my daughter and she says nothing, then my daughter's being a doormat. No. The difference between doormat and emotional Aikido is doormat is your daughter is weeping, upset, sad that she was left out of the party, but reluctant to say anything. Aikido is where your daughter's like, not worth it. Annoying to me, not worth it to take it up. My energy is better used elsewhere. So it's really helpful to think through these models of healthy conflict, and it can give us a way to support our girls and also reduce their overall stress. Okay, I'm big on tactics. So tactics is one of my favorite words, especially when we come to girls as they get deeper and deeper into the later grades. Girls and boys as a group approach school very differently. Of course, anytime you throw out a gendered finding or a stereotype, if you look at it carefully, it falls apart pretty fast. But we do have some broad strokes that hold together pretty well. So what we know about boys and girls at school is that girls as a group outmatch boys at school from the minute they set foot in a school building. Girls get better grades. They're in many ways better designed for school, just in terms of what is truly innate. They have better small muscle control, which is the ability to use pencil, articulate words. It is true genetically, biologically, that girls' ability to control their bodies actually begins earlier than boys. It's easier for girls to sit quietly and do school than it is for little boys to sit quietly and do school. And girls more than boys are socialized by the culture to really want to please adults, to really care about making the grown-ups happy. So this can be grown-ups at home and grown-ups at school. And so by and large, you start to see this huge thing that emerges, and it's very, very sturdy, where girls get better grades. It starts in elementary school. It goes all the way through graduate programs. One of the real challenges in college admissions is to try to keep somewhat even numbers of young men and young women admitted to schools, because the girls coming out of high school are such powerhouses as a group compared to the boys. Okay, there are exceptions all over the place. And so I don't want to say that all boys are like this and all girls are like that. That's not true at all. But the broad strokes are actually pretty well established. Now, this is interesting. It also can allow us to unwittingly add to girls' stress. So here's what I mean. Let's consider like 7th graders, because it's kind of fun to think about how this develops over time. So going with these stereotyped ideas of boys and girls. So a 7th grade girl and a 7th grade boy each turn in a paper in their respective schools, and they get back the paper and they have a B on the paper. The 7th grade girl may be unhappy with this, and maybe she worked for 2 hours on the paper to get a B. And so she's like, okay, I don't want to get another B, so I'm going to work for 3 hours on the next paper to see if that's what gets me an A. The 7th grade boy, again, highly stereotyped. One thing we know about boys is, while girls are trying to figure out how they can polish things to a high shine so as not to disappoint themselves or their teachers or their parents, boys as a group approach school thinking, okay, what is the absolute least I need to do to keep the grown-ups off my back? All right, this is really challenging at times for their parents. So that 7th grade boy who gets a B back on his paper may be like, okay, I spent half an hour on this. I got a B. Maybe I shouldn't have gotten that B. Maybe this is a kid who typically gets A's or should be expected to get A's. It's like, I'm going to give this another 20 minutes, 15 minutes, see if that actually bumps me up next time to the grades that I'm looking for. So boys are often much more tactical about school. They're often better at gaming it. They're often better at figuring out how to use their energy strategically. So let's say the boy throws on 20 more minutes of work. Let's say the girl throws on an hour more of work. Let's say they both come away with A's on the next paper. So what the boy has figured out is, okay, it doesn't take that much more, right? Like this is the increment more to get the outcome I want. What the girl has figured out is that she's now reinforced this idea of like an additional hour is what's necessary to get herself over the line. Though it may not have been, right? Because she didn't test. She just sort of overexerted. And we see this again and again and again in this, kind of more stereotyped look at girls in school, where, a girl will try to get a high A on everything. That the goal is to always get a high A or a very high grade, or if there's extra credit, to do the extra credit, even if she's already got the grade in the class that she wants. Or if the teacher assigns 40 flashcards, she'll make 60 just to be safe, things like that. So girls can become very inefficient at school, going over and over things, rewriting their notes in a color code, things like this. And it's easy as adults to unwittingly reinforce this, that as girls are creating these elaborate color codes, or as they're studying, or they're bringing home glowing grades, paper after paper after paper, it's easy to sort of cheer them on. And the challenge in this is girls usually don't, or can risk not figuring out what they can do on muscle alone. They or on their brains alone, like on their basic innate capacities. They're always sort of adding on so much extra effort that they don't necessarily figure out what they can do if they don't hardly try, because they never hardly try. So part of what we want to do as parents is to start to disrupt this a little bit. Okay, so here's how I spoke about this with your daughters. I said to them, first, you have to have a work ethic. And, by ninth grade, most girls have a pretty good work ethic. And as soon as you have a work ethic, and I would say this, actually, what I'm saying now, I would say to your sons, say to your daughters, like this becomes like the gender piece falls away entirely. First, students need a really good work ethic. Everybody needs to know how to work, when to work, how to really put their nose to the grindstone when the time has come. Then, once that's established, it's time to become strategic about school. And the way I said it to your girls is, think of yourself as having a tank of gas that's going to get you through the night or through the week or whatever. You need to know where you should be flooring it and where you should be coasting. And you are the one who needs to actually start to make those strategic decisions so that you can do everything you need to do without running out of gas. The problem with girls is too often they just floor it for everything, often because we've been cheering them on in their early grades as they've done this, and they don't learn about coasting and flooring it as necessary. Okay, so where do you, the parents, come into this process of trying to help your daughter use her energy efficiently and tactically? So first, assess, does she have a work ethic? If the answer is yes, now what you say to her is not back off, ease up. This makes them bananas, especially when we've been cheering and cheering and cheering all of their wonderful extreme efforts. Then when we say you need to back it off, you're working too hard, they're like, what are you talking about? Like, this is what you've been cheering for years. What do you mean? So instead we say, okay, great. And this is sort of how I set it up for them. The next step in your development as a student is to become strategic in the deployment of your efforts. So if you see your daughter rewriting her notes or color coding, you should say, have you taken a practice test as a way to study? Practice tests are incredible ways to study. They help girls quickly home in on what they do know and what they don't know. And what I said to your daughters today, take practice tests, study what you don't know. Don't go over the stuff you know. Girls spend a lot of time going over material they already know because they find it comforting. It's very, very inefficient. If your daughter keeps bringing in glorious grade after glorious grade and is very tired, you should consider saying to her, what grade do you want in this class? Okay, what can you get on the next test and still keep that grade? As long as it's not material that builds on itself and that she's going to, shoot herself in the foot by not having total mastery, it is really helpful to encourage our daughters to do what a lot of sons have already figured out. Boys very naturally are calculating this. A friend of mine had 3 sons. She said, oh, they referred to it as the art of the 89.5. At their school, that was the lowest grade they could get that would still round up to an A, and they're all shooting for the 89.5. This, again, is very frustrating as a parent sometimes, because when the kid blows it, he really blows it. But girls need more of that in their approach to things. And for us to praise them for doing that, to encourage them to be tactical, to help them see school as something that can be strategized and gamed, is not anti-academic. It's not anti-intellectual. It's actually sustainable given the demands that we actually put on students these days. Okay, and then finally, I talked with your daughters about thinking about contents versus containers. And this came up a bit in the context of talking about social media and where it fits into young people's lives. And I think social media is really complicated, and there's a lot to say about the part it plays in the lives of young people and girls in particular. But there's no question, we've got new data all over the news about how looking at social media can really make girls feel bad about themselves, girls in particular, much more than boys. And the reality is that the environments they're looking at online are 2D environments that are very much designed to focus on appearance and outward look. And so the way I suggested they might think about this is to play against the idea of there's the contents and there's the containers. So whatever they're looking at online, whatever's getting liked online, whatever's appealing online is entirely about container. It is about the outward appearance of the person in that image. And what I said is, it's very hard as the world is sort of obsessed with female containers and obsessed with, young women and their containers and places a very high value on a particular kind of container. But we have to remember all the time, it's the container. There's nothing that can really be demonstrated in a social media environment about the contents of who that person is, how funny they are, how interesting they are, how good they are to the people around them or not good they are to the people around them, what they're working on, the skills they're developing. And we want to bear in mind that every second we spend thinking about the container is a second we rob from thinking about or cultivating the contents. And so as they are looking at containers all around, they're aware that people are also looking at their containers. I want them to think about that as a bit of a zero-sum game. And that's how I put it. Like you're either thinking about the container or you're thinking about the contents. And then the most important thing that I emphasize to them is you actually don't have much control over the container. It's the contents where you have the large sum of your control. Containers are pretty much genetic. They're pretty much handed to you. You can kind of wrest some control over it, but not that much. The thing you control is the contents. And that's really where you want to put your energies. And I said to them, you should enjoy, if you want to have fun with your container, have fun with your clothes, have fun with your hair. Like you can take pleasure in it. But let's never, ever, ever forget it's just the container. It is literally the most superficial aspect of who you are. And that everything that really matters and everything that's really good and everything you really control is the contents inside. So I don't know, how much that will change how they talk and think and approach these things. But I will tell you, I've arrived at this place. I'll tell you how I've arrived at this place is I don't find it useful to say to girls, everyone's beautiful, because I don't think they believe that. I think they're like, you may think I'm beautiful because I'm your daughter, but the world has made it really clear the very narrow range of what's a celebrated form of beauty. So I think that doesn't necessarily resonate so well with them. And the other problem I have with that is we're still talking about beauty. We're still talking about beauty as a value, as opposed to talking about what's inside a person as the absolutely most valuable thing they have. So let me wrap up there, and then I would love your thoughts and questions.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. So please feel free to continue to put your questions in the Q&A or the chat. I'm going to start with one that goes a little bit with social media, as you were just finishing up with that. So what do you suggest, or any tactics that you would suggest if your daughter is still attached to her phone, despite it perhaps making her feel bad every time she's on?
It's very addictive. It's very powerful. So there's a couple of ways to go at this. I'm going to start by saying something that you may not agree with at all, and I'm just going to say it anyway. And I'm not a very prescriptive psychologist. I will just say that as a general thing. I don't think kids should ever have technology in their bedrooms. Like, full stop. If I were the queen of the universe, there would be some machine that vaporized any technology that a kid was trying to take in their bedroom. This is not always feasible in families. For some kids, the absolute only place they can study is their rooms, and they have to take their computer in there to do it. But even under those conditions, I would say then it should come out. No one who should be sleeping should have technology in their bedroom. And I'll tell you where I'm coming from on this. We have, at this point, literally hundreds of studies documenting how incredibly disruptive it is to everything to have technology in your bedroom. And we have still today 0 studies making a case for having technology in a bedroom. So I think just based on the data alone, there's no good reason. Okay. But why this rule? So first of all, because the studies are on my side. And second of all, because it's a pretty straightforward rule that does a surprising amount of containment. Like eventually your kid has to go to bed. And if the technology doesn't go with them, at least you've got that parameter in terms of separating your kid from their technology, is that it's not with them overnight. The other thing is, nothing good happens on social media in the middle of the night. Like if you want to see your kid do something dumb and impulsive, 1 o'clock in the morning is a really good time for that to happen. So that's also good. The other thing is, it contextualizes social media in the broader universe and world. If it's not squirreled away in someone's room in some place that feels private, doing social media where you could walk by reminds your daughter all the time she's doing social media. It's part of the world over here. It's not the world. So if you're looking for just a very straightforward, simple thing, that would be that. I know it's very hard to walk it back if she's had technology in her room for a really long time. Blame me. You can be that lady who spoke to you at school. She seemed nice, but she said you can't have your phone in your room. I'm very sorry. And she lives on the other, halfway across the country. So I don't know, you talk to her. Okay, so do that. Then the other way to contain it is to think about not being against the technology, but being for other things. There are things that are essential to child and adolescent development that should not be disrupted by technology. Okay, so I'm going to give you 5. And my advice is fill her time with these 5 as much as you absolutely can. And that will also minimize the time on technology. So one is sleep. If you have very young daughters, elementary school, they need 11 hours of sleep. Your middle schoolers need 10 hours of sleep. Your high schoolers need 9 hours of sleep. No high schooler in America is getting 9 hours of sleep, but that's the target. They should be active physically. They should be out and about moving their bodies. They should be helping the world or your home in some way. They should be contributing to people beyond themselves. They should be studying in a focused way. So they shouldn't have their technology interrupting them constantly. Doesn't mean they can't use their technology. It has to be on do not disturb. And they should be having in-person interactions. They should be looking at you. They should be looking at their friends. So think about filling their, first of all, get it out of their rooms if you can, then keep them busy with activities, being with you, being busy around the house, doing their work, doing all of these things. And then the technology can fill in the edges. But if it's crowding out those things, it's too much technology.
Great, thank you. So going back a little bit to the how to manage a meltdown tools, which everyone has said were such great strategies and we're excited to share with everyone. Do you have any guidance for some of the parents here who have daughters who are younger, so perhaps in the lower or middle school, who come home and have a meltdown about something like their shoes when we know that's not really the problem? So they're asking, how do we understand how to support them if they aren't able to articulate what's wrong?
Oh yeah, no, I love that. So it's such a good example, like the end of the day meltdown about something you're like, this cannot possibly be. So one of the ways I think about this when I'm thinking of is clinically, but this works really well in your homes. So I'm going to go kind of high level and then walk it down to the ground, is we think about emotion management in terms of expression and containment. And healthy emotion management actually involves both of those. So sometimes if a kid is expressing a lot, overwrought about their shoes, they need help with containment. And sometimes kids are shut down, not talking, they need help with expression. So we just think in those two things. And those two things together give us emotion regulation. Emotion regulation is as good as it gets. There's no happiness all the time. There's emotion regulation. Now, interestingly, the bookmark starts you in expression and moves you to containment. So if talking is giving relief, you're in business. So listening without interrupting, offering empathy, validating distress, those are all expression. You're promoting expression. And for most kids, expression will give relief and they'll be fine. If they're expressing, and it's not getting better, then you move into containment. Support coping, offer confidence, offer to help problem solve. So if you think in that framework, it can help. Okay, now think about little kids losing it about their shoes at the end of the school day. There are 2 things that are highly containing. And when we say containment in psychology, we don't mean like stuff it, ignore it. We mean the ability to actually not feel swamped by feeling. One is a good night's sleep is one of the most powerful assets you have when it comes to containment. The other is a really good snack. If you have a kid who is absolutely falling apart, especially a younger kid, first thought I would be is like, are they hungry or are they tired or are they both? And so if you have someone who is just absolutely losing it over very small things, you might say, why don't we get a snack? Or why don't we think about getting you to bed a little earlier tonight? Like, why don't we, kind of help you get your feet under you? Distraction is also a really powerful containing force. We talk about distraction like a bad thing. If somebody is looping on something and going round and round and round and round, helping them to actually get off of it for a little bit, like, why don't we go take the dog for a walk, can actually be a wonderful form of containment. I had my younger daughter was very upset the other night. She decided she hated all her classmates. I know she does not hate all her classmates. She was very tired. She needed to go to bed. I finally said to her, let's do this. Why don't you go to bed so you can hate them with a full tank of gas tomorrow? And so she agreed. And then she woke up and then she was like, I can't wait to see so-and-so at recess. I was like, it was entirely fatigue. It was entirely fatigue.
Thank you. So one question that's sort of coming up a little bit is how much or how to ask about how school was or how the grades are going without adding pressure. What is a good dinner table topic? What's the best question to ask to not create that atmosphere?
Daggers shot at you across the table. It's really sweet. So we want to know how school went, right? We haven't seen them all day. We're not always sure what to ask about. So we want to say, like, how was school, right? This is sort of very top of mind for us. This tends to be a really relatively unsuccessful conversational strategy in our homes. Okay, so why is this true? So it's first important, I think, to discuss why it's true. So no matter how wonderful your daughter's school is, and I know it's a wonderful school. It is still a really long day. They go from class to class to class, and it's really the equivalent, if we put it in adult terms. Imagine if I said to you, okay, I'm going to grab you and 20 other people, and you're going to have a meeting, and that meeting's going to last for 50 minutes. You don't get to choose what the topic of the meeting is or how the meeting is going to be run, but you have to sit there for that meeting. Okay, good. That's over. Now I'm going to take you all down the hall, and you're going to have another meeting. Same deal. No choice of the topic, no choice of how it gets run. You actually don't like this topic of the meeting, but it doesn't matter. You have to do this. Next meeting, oh, you like the topic of the meeting, but same deal. You sit there for 50 minutes. Like, this is school. It's like a series of meetings, right? And you know how we feel about meetings as adults, right? But this is school, and they do it graciously and gorgeously, and they're amazing, and they're so lovely and wonderful. But I think we have to remember that when we say to them at the end of the day, how was school? It would be as though our life partner said to us, tell us about every meeting you had today. Like, could you recount your meetings? And we'd be like, no, they're over. I don't want to talk about them. I have all the same meetings tomorrow. Like, I just want to be here now eating my good food. So our well-meaning how was school tends not always to land in the way we mean it for it to land. So I think there are things that you can do, like saying, give me the highlight and the low light of the day, right? And that can really be a nice way of acknowledging, like, maybe there was something that was good today, and maybe there was something that was really lousy, and I'm here for all of it. So things like that. Another thing that can work really well is to be like, was there anything really funny that happened today? Or is there anything about today that you would want me to know, right? I mean, to really lower the bar, beyond a reporting out. What is really, really essential, and this is what I hear from kids all the time, is they get home from school, they don't feel like talking about school, we're asking about school, they don't want to talk about school because it's their meetings. Like, what is there to say? It's the same as meetings as yesterday. And then what they often tell me is, then I'll put a topic on the table and my parent will miss it. So that happens a lot. And often it happens a lot because we feel like, oh no, we were going to talk at dinner and now I'm back to my email, or I'm going to go do this. And so then when our kid says, oh my gosh, math was really frustrating, we're like, and then we move on to the next thing. So what I would say is, look for those openings, look for those possibilities that they're putting in front of you. And then the last thing I will say, one of my columns I wrote a long time ago was called, What Do Teenagers Want? Potted Plant Parents. So they like us around. They like us to be like potted plants. They don't like our agendas. And that's something I think about a lot with teenagers, is they're surrounded by adults with agendas. When we engage them, when their teachers engage them, when their coaches engage them, usually we have an agenda. And that's really tiresome for them. And so one thing that can be very, very helpful is to be present with no agenda, quietly folding laundry, reading the newspaper where they can find you. Basically be in their traffic pattern with no agenda. They will often start a conversation. But we have to get past the idea that we get to decide when that conversation happens, and we're the ones who get to start that conversation. And we start it by asking the question that's interesting to us. If you set all of that aside and think, how do I quietly be in her traffic pattern? So if she wants to talk, she knows where to find me, and I'm actually attuned and ready to listen, you'll have a lot more conversations.
Thank you. So I know I'm cognizant of the time and we only have a few more minutes. So I'm going to try to sort of ask you two questions. One, I hope will sort of wrap things up a little bit. The first being, for our range of age groups, so lower school all the way through upper school, what are some tips or ideas to ease, whether it's stress or anxiety, sort of two sides of the spectrum, things in the world, COVID, war, things on the news that may get to the girls that cause stress, and then things that are not actually a problem at all that are also causing extreme stress. So friendship struggles in middle school or things like that that are causing some real anxiety and stress that might feel like a panic attack, even though they shouldn't be. So that's one. And then hopefully we can wrap up with a couple of questions, just if there's anything else that the girls wanted the parents to know. And we can maybe end on that note.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so let me start with the middle one around stuff that doesn't feel like a big deal, but the girls are having a big deal about it. So one of my favorite phrases, a friend of mine who's a middle school director would talk about those things saying, it's not true, but it's real. Like whatever it is that's upsetting the girl, it's not true, but it's real. Like, so it may not, like so-and-so, yelled at me, the teacher yelled at me, this kid was really mean to me. It may not have really even happened. And yet she's feeling it really deeply. It is really powerful for us to say, that sounds awful, or it sounds awful for it to feel that way. Is there anything I can do that won't make it worse? Or is there anything you can think of that would help you feel better? So you're not actually saying it did happen or it didn't happen and it's important, it's unimportant. You're basically saying, I love you and you're telling me you're in emotional pain and that's got to be really lousy. And I'm here to help. Like, I don't want you to feel that pain. Like, what would be something that could help you to feel better? But keeping it at that level is really, really helpful. Even if it to us seems like a trifle or something kind of superficial or silly, what we're saying is you're upset, that matters, even if the thing itself seems small. As for the big stuff, the world, the news, the climate, this is big, scary stuff. One piece of it is a little regulation around exposure to it. I mean, especially for little kids. Little kids don't need to see visual images of really frightening things. And I would be very cautious about how much visual imagery they see if there's a crisis or something really frightening. It's like reading something versus watching the movie, like the movie really penetrates in a different kind of way. So if the news is really rough and you've got it on in your home, I would be really careful about when it's on. For bigger kids, they bring legitimate concerns and they have legitimate questions. This is where being at a Sacred Heart school, where there are opportunities to do purposeful work, to contribute in ways that one cares about politically or in ways that one cares about environmentally, let them use all of their adolescent and young person energy in the name of trying to make the world a better place. That's what Sacred Heart is about. So you are in the right place to help them feel not helpless in the face of these things that are so big and frightening. And so that's a way to think about it. And then just in terms of a few like other things from the girls, they were just absolutely wonderful. The girls, they said, I want validation when I'm upset. I don't need you to give me solutions. Like, if you'll just tell me that you understand that what I feel makes sense. One of the things I thought was such a nice thing that was said is, let me vent. So that was already in the bookmark, but they said straight out, I just need to vent. And I'll tell you, I was actually at a Sacred Heart school. It was Sacred Heart of the Country Day, Stewart School, Sacred Heart of the Country Day. It's like got like 14 things in New Jersey years ago. And it was so funny. I asked the ninth grade, I was like, what would you, and it was all of the upper school. I said, what would you like me to tell your parents tonight? And this ninth grade girl raised her hand and she said, please do this. I'll quote her exactly. She said, could you tell my parents that when I get home from school at the end of the day, and I tell them all about my day and how bad it was, the only thing I want them to say back to me is, oh my God, that sucks. She was like, that's it. That's all I want. So that comes to you straight from the wise young woman in New Jersey. And then the last one, and this is a really nice thing to end on. I thought it was really nice. They said, can we focus on the good stuff and not just the bad stuff? Like when when I'm having a time, can we not just focus on the places where I'm coming up short, but can we also focus on the things I'm doing really well? And I thought that was very lovely. And I certainly am sympathetic to this, both from the parent side, where of course we worry about the things that are not going well, and that's going to be our focus. And of course, from the kid side, where what we think of them and what we point our energy to and our attention to matters tremendously. And they so want to feel like they're doing right in our eyes.
What a perfect place to wrap up. Thank you so much, Dr. Damour. This has been such a great day to spend with you. I know our students enjoyed it. We've already heard wonderful feedback from them. And this was just such a wonderful presentation that I hope everyone who's logged in enjoyed. Thank you. We had a wonderful group in attendance. We will post this recording in the parent portal under the Wellness Resources tab. So you'll be able to log in and access that, or listen to anything again. So thank you again. It was so wonderful. And we'll certainly be getting those bookmarks out to everyone in the community soon.
Okay, thank you. All right, everybody, have a great night.
Thank you.